Jack the Ripper was aptly named. He literally ripped, he mutilated the women that he came into contact with.
Over the last 125 years, Jack the Ripper has not only become an international icon of fear, but also a major figure in London folklore.
Jack the Ripper is a legend, but we mustn't forget his victims. These are women who, whatever the condition of their life, did not deserve to be murdered.
In 1888, the East End of London played host to a gruesome spate of horrific murders which to this day remain unsolved. Now, more than a century later, a macabre fascination surrounds the world's most infamous serial killer, Jack the Ripper. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm examining some of the nation's most brutal murders. What motivates a person to kill, and what makes them think they can get away with it?
Some murders become so legendary they live on in the public's imagination for years. They inspire books, films, theatre, and even copycat killers. Jack the Ripper is the most famous of all. In 1888, the East End of London was haunted by this notorious butcher. Over 3 months, 5 women were slaughtered and mutilated around the Whitechapel district. But the perpetrator was never found.
Author John Bennett has studied the mysterious killer in depth. What is it about Jack the Ripper that the public finds so exciting even to this day?
I think the one thing that holds everything together, that keeps everyone coming back to it, is the fact that it's a mystery. You know, despite the fact that there's been loads of people who think they know who Jack the Ripper is, in honesty, we don't know. So that attracts people. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. People want to find out who done it. Even at the time of the murders, you know, he was becoming mythology. And then you start getting the man with the top hat and the cape and the little bag. So he's almost being given a supervillain image that people can latch onto.
In the late 19th century, the East End housed the poor of London. Dirt, squalor, and disease plagued the area.
That's where they put all the factories, the stink industries, the tanneries, the breweries, the slaughterhouses and such like. And of course you've got the London docks as well, which were massive at that time. So it was a real sort of melting pot of different cultures, social classes, but also there'd been a recession going on at the time. There weren't enough jobs for the amount of people that wanted them. And the bottom line was that poverty was the result.
Whitechapel is on the outskirts of the financial centre of the City of London. The city led the world as the trading capital of the Victorian era. Author Linda Chapman has delved into London's historic past.
Well, Whitechapel was a very densely populated area. Tremendous overcrowding. You would have perhaps a whole family, not only living, but also maybe occupying one room, but also plying a trade in that room. And so a lot of life took place on the streets. There would be buying and selling, socializing, crime, of course, in the streets. Busy, crowded, teeming area.
During the 1880s, there were more than 3,000 killings over a 10-year period in the Whitechapel area. It's thought that Jack the Ripper actually carried out 5 attacks, although the names of the victims and the number of murders is still up for debate.
You've got your 5 victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly. They're the ones that come up, and probably they are considered to be the genuine victims of Jack the Ripper because of the similarity in the way they were murdered. And also Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNaughton wrote a memorandum that was made public in the 1950s where he said that Jack the Ripper, or the Whitechapel murderer, had 5 victims and 5 victims only.
On the 31st of August 1888, the name of 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols would forever be intrinsically linked with Jack the Ripper. She was the first canonical victim.
She was born, I would guess, into a sort of fairly regular working class family in near Fleet Street. and she had several brothers and sisters. She married a printer at St Bride's Church, and they had 5 children. Mary Ann, like many of the other victims, enjoyed a drink, maybe a bit too much, and it has been said that that was the reason why their marriage finally fell apart in 1880. And then really from that point on, she spent the life as a vagrant, really, and she came to the East End via South London to live in the doss houses that were around in Spitalfields, up that way. At that point, she was 42 years old, her hair was already going grey, she had 5 teeth missing, she was an alcoholic, and of course she was a prostitute. So life, basically, from the time she broke up with her husband, really plummeted.
In the 19th century, alcohol was fondly referred to as God's good creature because it provided relief from the pains of everyday life. Excessive drinking was frowned upon, but moderate drinking was the norm. Mary Ann Nichols was caught in a vicious circle. She was now selling sexual services in Whitechapel. Criminologist Professor David Wilson has explored the effect that vices could have on someone's life at the time.
There was some attempts to save her, to stop her selling sexual services, but each attempt would unravel in front of her eyes because, frankly, she was an alcoholic. Now, she encounters one of her friends whilst she's walking the streets just before midnight, and her friend says, "Oh, look, come back with me." Mary Ann Nichols refuses, says that she will be able to earn a few pennies so as to be able to pay for the bed for the evening.
And she was very drunk, apparently, by this stage. Some reports say as she walked, she was holding onto the wall. And she said she'd had the money already for the bed 3 times that day and had spent it all. So she had no money. She couldn't go back to the lodging house because no money, no bed. And then she walked off, probably looking for customer number 4. And that was the last time she was seen alive.
Where was she found and in what condition was she?
She was found in Bucks Row, which is a small narrow street of warehouses and terraced cottages, which is just behind Whitechapel Underground Station. It's still there. She was found lying on the pavement in front of a stable yard gate. On her back, her eyes were open, looking up into the sky.
PC John Neal found Mary Ann's body whilst on patrol.
And in the light of the lantern, he can see that she's got 2 cuts in the throat. When they took her to the mortuary, they found out that the cuts actually one of them went right back to the spine. And one of the inspectors was doing an inventory of her clothes and her belongings and made the discovery that under her skirts, which had been pulled down, there were 6 or 7 cuts and stabs. There was a huge gash from the groin right up to the breastbone, which, to a lot of people, was one of the most brutal things they'd ever seen.
The doctor comes, investigates what has happened to her. Her throat has been cut. When I say her throat has been cut, Fred, it doesn't really capture the savagery by which her throat had been cut. Her head had almost been decapitated, and there was also mutilation to her abdomen.
Forensic expert and retired Northumberland Police Inspector Norman Kirtland has spent his life studying crime scenes and piecing together profiles of serial killers.
How terrifying would that have been for the woman concerned?
The woman would have been in an incredible state of shock. She's probably been drunk at the time she takes the man through the yard. She's walking into the darkness looking for a place to lie or a place to have sex, and then suddenly she feels that the hand's behind her, the throat's cut. The body will go into instant shock. And when you look at some of the photographs afterwards, you find the left arms on the left breast, which probably indicates the woman's gone straight for her throat to try and stop the flow. Within about 30 seconds to a minute, the blood pressure's dropped so much that she can't do anything at all. And the real horror of this is that some of those injuries were inflicted while the woman was still alive and probably watching. They'd have been dead within a couple of minutes. But what they went through was indescribable.
Mary Ann Nicholl is considered the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. But 2 other prostitutes had been killed recently in the Whitechapel area.
Jack the Ripper's victims, if we accept, for example, there were 5 of them, were all prostitutes.
Yes.
Is that a coincidence?
We tend to find with most serial killers, or many of them, that the prostitutes tend to be the victims, and I don't think it's a coincidence in the sense that these women, by the nature of what they did, put themselves into a very dangerous, vulnerable position. So these would be the women who were on the streets late at night, and so it's no coincidence that these were the women who tended to be targeted.
The recent murders brought about a heightened awareness of these crimes by London's press. Only weeks before Mary Ann Nichols' murder, another prostitute was killed, Martha Tabram. She was stabbed 39 times by her attacker while working on the street.
The Ripper murders were all cut. Martha Chapman was stabbed, and that's a very, very different type of killing. I know it's really strange to talk about an ordinary killing, but most ordinary murders are committed by people who stab someone. There's a red mist, there's a bit of a frenzy goes on there, a bit of a bloodlust, and the person walks away. This is a very ordinary murder. So was Martha Tabram a Ripper victim, an early Ripper victim? Hard to say. The person might have changed, but the MO was quite different.
The Martha Tabram murder picked up a little bit from the national press, but nothing major. But with Mary Ann Nichols' murder, they began to link that one with these other two. And these other two we would consider Whitechapel murders. And this suddenly seemed like the ultimate outrage. And so you were getting newspaper reports from, the Times, the Telegraph, all the majors were beginning to report. And certainly when they did the inquest, that's where we today have a lot of the information from, because we don't have the original transcripts. It's all from the newspapers, and there's loads of it. They really caught on to this one. This is where it suddenly became big.
The horrific murder of Mary Ann Nichols had brought the poverty-stricken area of Whitechapel into the limelight. The police had a killer on the loose, but they were unaware just how dangerous and elusive the Ripper would be.
I'm re-examining the gruesome spate of murders committed by the infamous killer Jack the Ripper, and the fear that spread through the streets of the Whitechapel area of London.
A prostitute was murdered and viciously mutilated in the late summer of 1888. The police were stunned by the brutality of the attack, and the press had picked up on the horrific killing. The residents of London's East End were also in shock. Little did they know that only 8 days later, the Ripper would strike again. On the 8th of September, 47-year-old Annie Chapman, another alcoholic prostitute, became the next victim.
About 30 minutes before her body was found, a lady called Elizabeth Long was walking on her way to work down Hanbury Street, and as she passed number 29, she said that she saw a woman, who she later identified as Annie Chapman, in the mortuary, standing with a man. And the man was described as being a bit taller than Annie Chapman, wearing a deerstalker hat, of all things, clothes that had seen better days, and he was heard to ask Annie Chapman, "Will you?" And she replied, "Yes." That is effectively the last time she was seen.
Annie Chapman's body was found just before 6 a.m. by a local resident, John Davis.
She was literally lying at the back door, with her head touching the steps, lying parallel with the fence. There were 2 deep cuts in the throat, both of them going all the way round, right down to the spine. And she'd been opened up from the groin to the breastbone. They found pieces of flesh from the belly lying over one shoulder. The intestines had been lifted out and were thrown over the other shoulder. And in the mortuary, they found out that parts of her sexual organs had been extracted by the murder, and a large piece of the bladder as well. So that was a horrific sight.
With the extraordinary amount of blood that would have been involved, amazing that there weren't more witnesses.
One of the wonderful things, and I say that very, very carefully, about the way this guy operated was the fact that he did not have much blood at the scene. He approached the girls allegedly from the rear, and upon cutting the throats, made sure that the blood did not spurt and get onto him or at the scene. When you consider some of the officers who were investigating the murders afterwards are looking around, there's not a footprint, there's not a handprint. They were choreographed to absolute perfection. So there was no evidence that he was taking away and leaving behind him. He was very forensically aware. Very clever man.
His behaviour has escalated. The first murder of Mary Ann Nichols hasn't delivered enough of what it is that he's fantasising about. So in relation to Annie Chapman, he disembowels her. He takes her intestines and places them over her right shoulder. Now, I've said placed them. I imagine he was literally just simply moving these organs as a way of trying to see what was inside her body.
Is the suggestion that the Jack the Ripper had sex with these women or not?
No. It's very likely that Jack the Ripper was something called a piquerist. A piquerist is someone gets pleasure from stabbing or from actually cutting someone. That's where the sexual pleasure comes on. None of the girls, when they were examined by the doctors, showed any sign of sexual activity. So the likelihood is the sexual high he got was actually during the murder, and it wasn't with the girls themselves.
In the 19th century, a working girl's untimely demise was rarely reported in the press or even discussed in polite society. The sad reality was that many ladies of the night were subjected to violent attacks, and sadly, these sometimes resulted in their deaths.
At the time in Victorian England, prostitution was legal as long as it didn't create a public nuisance. In other words, you could sell sexual services. And so literally there were scores of brothels or of boarding houses in which women would sell sexual services. And in a sense, what we've also got to remember, that link between then and now. Nowadays, there would be an association between women who sold sexual services. In today's society, they would normally be addicted to Class A drugs. There's a one-on-one relationship between women who are selling sex on the streets and heroin addiction. When we're talking about the Victorian period, there's almost a one-on-one relationship between women who are selling sexual services and alcoholism.
And what sort of women were the prostitutes? Women who'd fallen on hard times?
Yes, many of these women, they had been married, but they perhaps had a drink problem. The husbands had abandoned them. Their marriages were over. Really, it was just pure economic necessity that drove them to this way of making a living.
By mid-September 1888, 2 prostitutes were dead, both murdered in the same way. And these horrific events were making headline news.
One of the reasons for the enduring appeal of the gruesome series of prostitute murders is the name Jack the Ripper. Written in blood-red ink in a letter to the Central News Agency on September the 27th, 1888, it provided the newspapers with the most infamous moniker in criminal history.
One of the things that really has some credibility is the fact that after Chapman's murder, a letter arrives signed Jack the Ripper. If you consider that after Chapman's murder, posters appear in London and they say capture leather apron. Now, if you're the best serial killer that London's ever known, perhaps the world's ever known, how do you feel about being called leather apron? You're going to want a different name, aren't you?
It was a very mocking letter, mocking the police for failing to catch him, threatening more murders and such like. But at the end, he signed himself, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And that's the first time anyone ever saw that name. And once it was publicised, it stuck.
There was something about it that just tripped off the tongue. And within days of that happening, we have an incident where a man accosted a woman in the street and then suddenly found himself surrounded by this mob of men all yelling, Jack the Ripper, Jack the Ripper. So within days, it was just all over the streets.
So you think Jack actually did write one of the letters?
Very, very likely. Very likely. If you put his ego in the same way as modern serial killers, organised serial killers would be, very, very possibly.
The killer had got away with the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman and had made a name for himself. With his new emblazoned identity, Jack the Ripper committed his next murder on the 30th of September, 1888.
His alleged third victim was Elizabeth Stride. Originally from Sweden, she came to London and married an older man called John. He died soon afterwards, and her life deteriorated.
It unravels because she is addicted to alcohol, addicted to drink. She's alcoholic. And very much in the same way as we've discussed with Annie Chapman and with Mary Ann Nichols, she is out in the streets at night selling sexual services so as to get enough money to pay for a bed for the evening.
A prostitute with an alcohol problem. the ideal victim profile for Jack the Ripper. The body of Elizabeth Stride was found at 1 a.m. by a market trader called Louis Diemschutz. He was driving his horse and cart down an alleyway towards his yard.
That particular morning, the pony stopped and shied to the side and wouldn't go any further, so he got off to see what was in the way, struck a match, because it was almost pitch black in that alleyway, struck a match. Before the wind blew the match out, he sees the body of Elizabeth Stride lying on the gutter.
What's interesting here for me as a criminologist is that it would seem obvious that Jack the Ripper on this occasion had been disturbed. There is still a very similar MO in relation to how Elizabeth Stride had been killed. Her throat had been cut. But the killer has not been able to engage in the kind of behaviour that we saw with Annie Chapman or Mary Ann Nichols, in that her abdomen hasn't been attacked. That's led some people to believe that this might not be a Jack the Ripper murder at all, but in fact I think it's because Jack the Ripper on this occasion was disturbed by Diemschutz appearing and wanting to get into the yard.
The police had very little to go on. There were possible sightings of events leading up to the murder, but no definite leads.
There is a very important sighting that happened about 1:45 when a man called Israel Schwartz was walking down Burner Street and saw a woman who he later described as being Elizabeth Stride being assaulted by a man in the entrance to the alleyway where her body was found 15 minutes later. Some people think that the man assaulting her was possibly the murderer.
Did the police handle it badly?
I wouldn't want to criticise the police because it was such an extraordinary series of cases. There was no real precedent for them in dealing with something of that kind. I think that they did the best they could at the time with what they were able to do.
And the vigilance committees were ordinary groups of frightened people who gathered together?
The vigilance committees were prominent local citizens. One of them was the local tradesman who understandably wanted to see the murderer caught, and they were very active. They used to patrol the area. They would lobby Parliament for a big reward to be offered. They might collect money themselves for rewards, and they were very active. Even them, even adding numbers of people to the street, still didn't catch the Ripper.
The Whitechapel area of London provided rich pickings for Jack the Ripper, with more than 1,000 prostitutes plying their trade in the area. Already 3 of them, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman and Elizabeth Stride, had met their deaths at the hands of the brutal killer. Would there be more, and just how many? I'm investigating the gruesome case of Jack the Ripper and the flood of murders that spread through London's East End.
It was September 1888, and over the course of a month, 3 prostitutes had been killed in the most brutal manner. The killings caused fear and panic.
What you would find is that women particularly were very nervous of strange men. If a man came up to them, they might panic, they might scream, they might denounce him as Jack the Ripper. Any person who was a foreigner or maybe had sort of unusual clothing would be denounced as Jack the Ripper. Next thing they knew, there'd be a howling mob, a hue and cry. They'd be chased down the street and pelted with stones. It was very, very panicky.
Jack the Ripper had been disturbed by market trader Louis Diemschutz during the murder of Elizabeth Stride and had failed to fulfill his dissection of her body. He had unfinished business, and it wasn't long before another woman was to fall victim to the killer, 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes.
She was killed only hours after Elizabeth Stride on the 30th of September 1888. Jack the Ripper committed a double murder.
She was from Wolverhampton, had lived with a man called John Kelly for about 7 years previously. She had a steady chap, if you like, lived in the same doss house. So she's one of the ones where they debate whether she was actually a prostitute or not. He had no idea whether she would go out on the streets. Her murder was the worst one so far.
She was last seen alive by a group of men coming out of a Jewish working men's club. They saw a woman looking like Catherine Eddowes with her hand on a man's chest. 9 minutes later, Police Constable Edward Watkins discovers her body in a dark corner of Mitre Square. Yet again, Jack the Ripper had mutilated his victim.
She had deliberate cuts made in her face, going through the eyelids, the lips, the nose was cut off. There were peculiar upside-down V's cut into the cheeks. And then you've got the usual Ripper stuff, the neck cut back to the spine. She's disemboweled. And on that occasion, the murderer had removed her uterus and her left kidney. And it was all done in less than 9 minutes in the dark.
So he's taking trophies by this stage as well. He's literally removing pieces of the body to take back to wherever it is that he's staying as a way of reminding himself of the moment that he took her life.
The mutilation showed alarming precision and has provided debate amongst Ripperologists about the level of skill required to perform these acts.
Throughout the murders, people would suggest that he had some anatomical skill, anatomical knowledge. The doctor that did the post-mortem there was the first person to say genuine anatomical skill, because he removed the uterus without damaging the bladder and removed the kidney quite skillfully. I've spoken to many people who've actually removed kidneys and things like that, and they say it's not easy.
I think a person who has butchery experience could do what he did. And don't forget, people in those days, they'd buy animals and they would carve them up and they would gut them and they would cook them. I mean, much the same as when I was a youngster, I saw my grandfather do. So you've got a basic knowledge, and it doesn't take much knowledge once the intestines are removed to find little bits and pieces. It doesn't take medical skill. It takes a knowledge of butchery, and I think that's about it.
After the body of Catherine Eddowes was found, it was noted that part of the apron that she was wearing over her skirts was missing.
It looked like it had been cut off with a knife, and they found the missing piece an hour or so later, not in the City of London in Mitre Square where the body was found, but over back in the East End near Petticoat Lane Market, and it was covered with blood, and that's why it was looking so suspicious. And they took the piece back to the mortuary, and it fitted perfectly with the bit that was still attached to the body. And that really is the only genuine, if you like, bit of evidence, clue ever dropped by Jack the Ripper. But obviously in the days before CSI and forensic science as we know it, the blood couldn't be tested for blood grouping, there wasn't fingerprinting, things like that. It just gives us an idea of what direction the murderer must have gone in after killing in the city.
2 weeks after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, Joseph Lusk, received half a human kidney, and with it, a letter.
What did the letter say?
It said, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, to the piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." And the handwriting was very unusual, very scrawled. Nothing like the handwriting on the original Dear Boss letter.
The press, especially the tabloids, were having a field day. Panic was at its highest. The notoriety of the case was spreading around the world, from Europe to America. Theories as to the identity of the killer and the graphic drawings keeping the readers enthralled. There was also the Police Illustrated News, which was controversial. Why?
Well, this paper was an enormously popular weekly illustrated paper, and this was at a time when very few papers were illustrated at all. There were certainly no photographs. And what people maybe not be aware of is that the editor of the paper would send sketch artists to the locations of crimes, and they would sketch the locations. And these would then be converted into woodcuts, and they would be extraordinarily immediate, quite dramatic pictures.
If you ask someone, anyone in the world, what they know about Victorian London, they'll come back with maybe the Industrial Revolution, and they'll come back with Jack the Ripper. And that's the size of this man. That's what the media has done. That's what the press did back in Victorian times. And that's what we've done. And if you walk outside on the streets of Whitechapel now, 125 years later, the place is still thronged with people looking for locations where girls died.
Scotland Yard was under public scrutiny. The police had few clues to go on, but they still had a list of suspects to be investigated.
After Annie Chapman was murdered, there was a guy called Jacob Ischenschmidt, who was known locally as the Mad Pork Butcher. He was pulled up. There was a guy called William Piggott. He was considered to be quite deranged, lunatic with medical knowledge. There were a number of them, contemporary suspects. A man named John Pizer was arrested. They all realised later on that these men weren't anything to do with the murders. They had alibis, and some of them were actually safely under lock and key when the other murders took place afterwards.
The prolonged notoriety of Jack the Ripper continues because of the mystery surrounding the gruesome killer. No one really knows much about him, and the same can be said about his fifth canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, because her life remains shrouded in secrecy.
Mary Kelly, who's probably the most well-known of the victims, ironically, because we know the least about her. Everything we do know about her is what she told people during her life.
It had been almost 6 weeks since the last Jack the Ripper murder. On the 9th of November 1888, Mary Kelly was around 25 years old and working in the Whitechapel area as a prostitute. The last sighting of Mary Kelly was by her friend George Hutchinson as she was out and about on the streets. He saw her with another man.
She bumped into a very well-dressed man, an incredibly well-dressed man who sort of tapped her on the shoulder, spoke to her. They both laughed about something, and they linked arms and they walked off to Dorset Street to Miller's Court, and George Hutchinson followed them, and he stood out the opposite side of the road to where the entrance to Miller's Court was and watched them go down the alleyway.
Mary Kelly had become the suspected fifth victim of Jack the Ripper. She was found at 11:45 the next morning by the rent collector.
It is one of the most brutal murders that I have ever had to read about, whether we're talking about Victorian period or if we're talking about more contemporary murders. Because he had time to be with her, he literally obliterated this poor woman. He's been focused on the abdomen. In Mary Kelly, he also attacks the face. He literally removes her nose, removes her eyebrows, mutilates her face. You know, attacking the face in terms of a serial killer's behavior is a very personal statement.
I believe the identification was made by the colour of the eyes and hair. The neck was severed all the way around, right down to the bone. The knife had made marks in the vertebrae. The flesh from the neck going right down to the knees was stripped off down to the bones, so you saw the bare ribs and the bare thigh bones. It was all lying on the bedside table in large lumps, and everything inside her, except the lungs, had been taken out. And these organs were lying around her on the bed, they were lying on the bedside table, under her head, under her feet, apart from the heart, which was missing.
Even the extended attack on Mary Kelly didn't provide enough evidence for the police to trace the killer.
Why was he never caught?
For one reason, I think he knew the area so well, so he was able to make his escape very quickly. Clearly, because he did not in his manner excite any kind of suspicion in himself, he was never thought of or accused. Again, there's lack of any kind of forensic evidence in most of the cases. We have no crime scene photographs. In fact, we've only got one, the very last one, because that was in a house. But we have no photographs, and the police were worried about creating panic, and so the body is sort of lifted up and everything's sort of scrubbed away and put into the mortuary. So we've really got very little evidence. That is the problem. Nowadays, this person will be caught.
The area involved in the killings covered less than 1 square mile of the squalid ghetto that was the old East End of London. Jack the Ripper had marked his territory and made his place in criminal history. I'm exploring the case of Jack the Ripper, one of the most notorious serial killers in the world, whose gruesome murders still haunt the imagination today.
By November 1888, 5 brutal killings had been committed. The victims were working girls from the East End, and their bodies mutilated during the attacks. The police were perilously in the dark. But after the death of Mary Kelly, the murders appeared to stop, apart from one possible copycat killing the following year.
I think the question of why the murders stopped is one of the single most important questions you can ask about this series of murders. Any theory as to who Jack the Ripper was must answer that question satisfactorily. Because serial killers, and really there's no doubt about it, he was a serial killer as we would understand that term today. They don't just stop. They don't just say, oh, I've got tired of this, I'll do something else. So the murders stopped because the person who perpetrated them was either dead, in prison, in an asylum, or in some ways incapable of actually continuing what he was doing.
This all adds to the enigma of Jack the Ripper. The police at the time investigated a number of suspects, but as the 19th century turned into the 20th, the conspiracy theories on who done it grew.
At the time, the police left notes behind mentioning a number of suspects. There was Mr. Druitt, of course, who was the man who drowned himself in December of that year. There was Tumblety, the rather eccentric American doctor. He was on the scene at the time. And then, of course, there was Aaron Kosminski, who was known to be in the area and also was believed to be insane.
Forensic artist Norman Kirtland has a new lead and maybe another piece of the mysterious puzzle.
The favourite suspect I have at the present time is the new one, is the gentleman who goes by the name of William, a man who lives in Whitechapel. He lives local to the murders. He's intimate with the area. He is the local milkman, so he's got access there at night time. He's got butchery experience. He's got a history of abuse against women and children and violence. This is an ideal candidate to be in this place at that time, and I think this man's well worth a look at.
William was born in 1864 in Whitechapel and lived and worked as a milkman in the heart of Ripper territory. It was Diane Bainbridge who alerted Ripperologists to the possible connection. She discovered the links while researching her genealogy and found two families with confusing Christian and surnames. They seemed to be replica families, the Belchers in Whitechapel and the Williams in Hartlepool.
They were virtually a perfect footprint. If you put one on top of the other, the date of births for the sister, her husband and their daughter were exactly the same as the trio in Hartlepool. Same years of birth, same areas of birth, which were London and in Devon area, and same Christian names. The only thing that was different was the surname.
You had a whole family with the same Christian names but different surnames. And then I think when it dawned that these were exactly the same people, the same family, but their lives had just ended in Whitechapel and they'd gone to Hartlepool in the north east of England and started a completely new life for themselves. And there had to be a reason why a person would do that. Why would you change your name? Why would you relocate? And then when you start to look at his story and you see what kind of things this person was getting involved in, the kind of criminal activity, and then I think when Diane looked at Whitechapel itself in 1888 quite naively and thought, what was happening there to make this man go?
So I thought, well, perhaps he was a naughty boy. The myth in the family was that he was a bit of a scoundrel, and that they'd supposedly eloped, but basically this wasn't an eloping issue. They were married, they'd been married 4 years, they had a child. So I thought, well, what was Whitechapel like in 1888? I had absolutely no idea, and I just did the old-fashioned Google, let's see what the place was like, what the streets were like, the areas were like. And this came up every screen. It was like Jack the Ripper, 1888, Whitechapel. At first we joked, it was that must be why he's run away, he's Jack the Ripper.
When you compared the profiles then of William and Jack the Ripper, what similarities were there? How did they match?
It wasn't a deliberate comparison. As I said, when I was trying to actually disprove him, I was looking for things that would take me away. So I was looking for it to say something in the profile that would discount him. But it matched in everything. It was his age group was correct, local person, a person who could wander around at nights, had knowledge of butchers, had possibly police knowledge with his brother, and also forensic knowledge. So everything that anybody had written or put down, it was actually ticking all the boxes.
Will you ever be able to accurately say, without any shadow of a doubt, this man, this mystery man, William, was Jack the Ripper?
I don't think anybody could ever pin that on anybody. I don't think we'll ever know who Jack the Ripper really was. There'll be lots of suspects come up, but I don't think we'll ever clear this up. It's a crime that will go on forever. It's the enduring mystery.
And today the mystery continues, with memorabilia and tours bringing alive the puzzle that surrounds the Jack the Ripper case.
So, David, here we are, deep in the East End of London. Why?
Well, I wanted to bring you to where the murders, the scenes of where the murders took place for one particular reason. At the time, even as these murders were happening, people were paying a penny to see bodies displayed in shop windows. And this is the beginning of this idea of murderabilia. People coming to the sites where murders have taken place and basically becoming tourists of murder sites, what we call dark tourism, or more academically, thanatotourism. And here we are in the East End of London. Even today, people still do Ripper tours.
And pay good money to go on a tour?
Well, the reality is that murder sells. People want to identify with the places where the murders took place. And of course, when does that become disreputable? You see, these were murders that took place in 1888, so perhaps it's the history that gives it some respectability.
So crime does pay?
Absolutely, and in this case, murder or serial murder pays even more.
For decades, historians, criminologists, pathologists, police officers and amateur detectives have all studied the case to determine the real identity of the killer. There is even a term for these people, Ripperologists. But will they ever know the answer to crime's most elusive question?
Who do you think Jack the Ripper was?
Ooh, the million-dollar question. No suspect has cast iron proof that they could have done these murders. And I personally think that Jack the Ripper was probably someone who's just like most serial killers are today. They're anonymous, they're nobodies, they live with families, they live with people who have no idea what they're doing.
Well, the simple answer to that question is no one knows. And of course, there's a whole industry being built up in to try and identify the identity of Jack the Ripper. And you know yourself that there have been literally scores of candidates. You know, that this is the Queen's surgeon, William Gull. Patricia Cornwell, the famous novelist, wrote a book called Portrait of a Serial Killer and claimed it was Walter Sickert. I think those are fanciful theories and can often be easily disproved.
All the suspects who come up, if you look at the evidence against them, there's none of them can be pinpointed as being at the relevant time, at the relevant place. Wonderful circumstantial evidence, but would it get to court today? It would never get to court today.
Jack the Ripper has inspired over 200 books worldwide from authors as far away as Japan and Australia, each with their own theory on the identity of the horrific Victorian butcher.
Will we ever know who Jack the Ripper was?
I mean, personally, I don't think we will. There's so much scrutiny of this story and of the case that even if somebody rifles through the Metropolitan Police archives and finds a document signed by the head of CID, the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the various subordinates saying, this man was Jack the Ripper, we sent him down for this, boom, all signed, there will be people that will still say, that's a fake.
Jack the Ripper is a phenomenon. He was voted in 2006 the worst Briton in British history. He beat Oswald Mosley to the title. There's even a toy that you can buy of Jack the Ripper, a toy that will have a cape, a medical bag, and little knives that you can pull out. So Jack the Ripper is a phenomenon, and he's a phenomenon that is set to continue because we still cannot identify who this man might have been.
I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there were victims in this, and this is what tends to be forgotten. There was some comments made by some women who actually were at the scene of one of the crimes that was overheard by one of the journalists, and they said, well, she may have led a very dishonest life, but she didn't deserve this.
Jack the Ripper has become the most infamous serial killer in history. Of that, we can be sure. Yet his identity remains unknown.
The facts are hard to prove. They are surrounded in myth and mystery, and no hard evidence exists against any one suspect. Well, if the police were unable to put a convincing case together against anyone in the 1880s, what chance is there for the enthusiastic modern-day investigator? Only time will tell.